The moment I set foot in that conference room, my son looked up from his phone and laughed. Not a big laugh, just a short, quiet sound. The kind men make when they see something they find pitiful. My daughter-in-law leaned over and whispered something in his ear without taking her eyes off me. She was smiling, too. Then the attorney at the head of the table looked up. He was a gray-haired man in his 60s. The kind of lawyer who had seen everything and forgotten most of it. But the second his eyes found my face, he stopped. His hand, which had been reaching for a glass of water, froze in midair. The color left his face the way water drains from a tub all at once. He pressed his palms flat on the table to steady himself. "Bob," he said, barely above a whisper. "Bob Harmon." My son turned his head toward the attorney, confused. My daughter-in-law's smile flickered and disappeared. Nobody in that room, not my son, not his wife, not their slick little lawyer seated beside them, had any idea what that name meant to the man sitting at the head of the table. But he knew. He knew exactly who had just walked through the door. They thought they had won. They thought they were ending a story. They had no idea they were just beginning one. It started the way these things always start. With kindness. That's the part people forget. The cruelty doesn't arrive in a black coat with a warning label. It arrives warm and smiling, wearing a guest room and a casserole dish and a hand on your shoulder saying, "Dad, we want you close. After everything that happened with Mom, we want to make sure you're okay." My wife, Patricia, passed away 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless. 6 months from diagnosis to the end. We had been married 41 years. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every small kindness that needed returning. She was the gravity that held our family together. And when she was gone, I felt it in ways I couldn't describe to anyone who hadn't lived it. My son called 3 days after the funeral. His voice was careful and measured, the way it always was, when he had already made a decision and just needed me to agree to it. "Dad," he said, "we've been talking, Claire and I. You shouldn't be alone in that house. Come stay with us. Tampa's beautiful this time of year. Marcus is getting big. He'd love having his grandpa around." I should have heard what wasn't being said. I was 67 years old, a retired investigator with 30 years of reading people the way other men read newspapers. But grief does something strange to your instincts. It wraps them in cotton. So I said yes, packed 2 suitcases, sold the house Patricia and I had shared in Raleigh, and drove south. The house in Tampa was enormous, one of those new construction places in a gated community with a fountain at the entrance that nobody ever looks at. 4 bedrooms, a 3-car garage, a pool in the back with underwater lighting. My son was in medical device sales. He made good money. He spent better money. There was always a new car in the driveway, or a new watch on his wrist, or a new something that seemed designed to tell you he was doing very, very well. I was given the room at the end of the hall. It was pleasant enough. Clean. Quiet. A window overlooking the backyard. But I noticed, in those first weeks, that the room had no lock on the inside of the door. I didn't say anything about that. I tried to find my rhythm. I helped my grandson with his homework after school. I cooked dinner twice a week when my daughter-in-law's schedule ran late. I kept my footprint small. I was 70 pounds of luggage in a house that had no good place to put me. And I knew it. So I did what older men learn to do. I made myself invisible. The dinnertime conversations happened around me rather than with me. My son talked about his territory numbers, his quarterly targets, his upcoming conference in Scottsdale. My daughter-in-law talked about her interior designer, the kitchen renovation she was planning, the fundraiser she was organizing for my grandson's school. I sat at the end of the table and ate my food and nodded at the appropriate moments. And no one asked me a single question. My grandson was the exception. He was 9 years old and still young enough to believe his grandfather had something worth saying. He'd pull up a chair next to me after dinner and ask me about the things I'd done before he was born. I told him edited versions of the truth, that I used to figure out when people were lying about money, that sometimes I traveled to strange places and looked at old records and asked hard questions. He thought this sounded like being a spy, and I didn't correct him. The trouble started, as it often does, with a medical event that wasn't as serious as they needed it to be. 6 months after I moved in, I had a small episode at the breakfast table. A few minutes of confusion, a dropped coffee mug, a brief inability to form the right words. My son, who was home that morning, drove me to the emergency room. The doctors observed me for several hours and concluded that I had experienced a transient ischemic attack, a thanks in advance, what they sometimes call a mini-stroke, not a full stroke, no lasting damage, no significant cognitive impact. My son stood in the hallway outside my hospital room, speaking quietly to the neurologist. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. He asked questions that weren't about my recovery. He asked about prognosis. He asked about progression. He asked what kind of documentation would typically be generated from an event like this. I closed my eyes and lay still, and let the beeping machines speak for me. 2 weeks later, I came home from a walk my cardiologist had recommended daily exercise, and found my daughter-in-law sitting at the kitchen table with a man in a pale blue button-down shirt who had the smooth, rehearsed bearing of someone who gets paid to ask questions. She introduced him as a patient care coordinator, though she said it quickly, and didn't meet my eyes when she said it. He asked me several questions, simple ones at first. What day was it? What year? Could I tell him the name of the current president? Then more layered questions. Could I describe my daily routine? Did I manage my own finances? Was I comfortable driving? I answered every question precisely and completely. I was pleasant. I thanked him for his time when he left. That evening, I called my friend Walter, who had been my supervisor for 17 years at the National Insurance Fraud Bureau before I retired. Walter now ran a small private consultancy in Atlanta. I told him what I'd seen, what I'd heard in the hospital hallway, what I suspected. He didn't say much at first. Then he said, "Bobby, send me their names. All of them. Just names and whatever addresses you have. Let me put my people on it. Give me a week." He called back in 4 days. What he told me wasn't a surprise. But hearing it, said out loud, plainly, without decoration, still did something to my chest that no thanks in advance had ever managed. My son and daughter-in-law had spent the last 3 months meeting with an elder law attorney named Gerald Frisch. Frisch specialized in what was delicately called capacity proceedings, which was the legal framework for declaring an elderly person unable to manage their own affairs and transferring that management to a designated family member. They had ordered a private psychological evaluation. The evaluator, a man named Dr. Raymond Purcell, had conducted what he described as a comprehensive cognitive assessment. He had produced a report, 12 pages, concluding that I exhibited early-stage cognitive decline with indicators suggesting progressive deterioration. I had never met Dr. Raymond Purcell in my life. Walter's people dug further. Purcell was a real psychologist, licensed and in good standing, which was more than could be said for the expert who had been used against the man in that video I would never know about. But Purcell had a different problem. He had lost a malpractice suit 4 years ago, a significant one, and had settled out of court for an amount that had quietly wiped out his savings and his professional reputation among the better hospitals in the region. He was currently seeing private clients in a strip mall office in Clearwater, and was, by all accounts, available for work that required fewer ethical guardrails than the standard of care demanded. He had been paid $18,000 by my son through a personal check, because my son was thorough but not meticulous to produce a report he had never earned through actual evaluation. The report was then submitted to Gerald Frisch as the evidentiary foundation for a petition to establish guardianship over my person and my estate. My estate. This was the part that required me to sit still for a long time and look out the window at nothing in particular. When Patricia died, she left everything to me, the house in Raleigh, which I sold for just over $400,000, plus a life insurance policy worth another $250,000, plus a small portfolio of mutual funds she had tended like a garden for 3 decades. The total, conservatively, was close to $900,000. My son knew the number. I had told him, in one of those early conversations after the funeral, when grief makes you honest and open in ways you later regret. I had said, "Son, your mother was careful her whole life, and she left us comfortable. I want you to know that. Whatever happens to me, you and Marcus will be taken care of." He had hugged me when I said that. But Walter found something else. Something that turned the estate from a motive into an emergency. My son's company had been restructured 6 months ago. 3 of his largest accounts had moved to a competitor. His commission structure had been renegotiated downward. The house in the gated community, purchased at the peak of the market with a variable rate mortgage, was now carrying a monthly payment that his reduced income no longer comfortably covered. He had taken out a home equity line of credit maxed out. He had 2 car payments, a private school tuition, a country club membership, and a credit card balance that Walter's contact described, diplomatically, as alarming. My son wasn't just greedy. He was drowning. He needed my $900,000 the way a man in open water needs a rope. I put the phone down after Walter finished talking. I looked at the ceiling of my small room at the end of the hall, the room with no lock on the inside of the door. I thought about Patricia, about what she would have said if she had known. She would have cried first. She would have cried for a long time, because that was how she was built. She felt things before she analyzed them, and she grieved them before she acted on them. But then she would have dried her eyes. She would have looked at me with that clear, steady gaze she had, the one that reminded me why I married her in the first place. And she would have said, "Robert, you know what to do." I did know what to do. I just needed to do it quietly. Most people who knew me in my professional life knew me by a name I hadn't used in nearly 10 years. It wasn't an official designation, nothing so dramatic as a code name or a title. It was simply what the people I worked with called me, because of the way I worked. When you spend 30 years investigating insurance fraud, you develop a particular skill. Fraud is almost never about a single lie. It's a system of lies carefully arranged, mutually supporting, each one holding the others in place. Most investigators attack the system directly, look for the biggest inconsistency, hammer it until something breaks. That method works, sometimes, but it's slow and it's loud and it gives the other side time to rearrange. My method was different. I looked for the smallest thread, the detail so minor that nobody thought to hide it, and I pulled it. Gently, precisely, the way a surgeon makes an incision, not with force, but with accuracy. One clean cut in the right place, and everything else falls open. They called me the auditor. I had put 23 people in federal prison. I had recovered, over the course of my career, just under $200 million in fraudulent claims. I had testified before Congress once, briefly, about the mechanics of large-scale insurance fraud. And afterward, a senator from Tennessee had stopped me in the hallway and said, "Mr. Harmon, I have never in my life seen someone make numbers tell a story like that." I thought of that senator as I sat down at the small desk in my room and opened the laptop I always kept with me, the one my son assumed was for email and recipe websites. The desk was modest. The chair was slightly too low. The room smelled faintly of the plug-in air freshener my daughter-in-law used in the hallways. None of that mattered. I began with the simplest available thread, the payment to Dr. Raymond Purcell. My son had written a personal check. That check, once deposited, left a trail account numbers, routing codes, a paper architecture that people like my son don't think about because they've never had to think about it. Within 4 hours, I had confirmed what Walter's people had told me, but now I had the documentation myself, clean and sourced and usable. Then, I moved to the guardianship filing. Gerald Frisch, the elder law attorney, had submitted the petition to the Hillsborough County Circuit Court. The filing was a matter of public record. I read every page of it that night. It cited my thanks in advance as evidence of incapacity. It cited Purcell's fabricated evaluation as clinical support. It cited 3 specific incidents: my dropped coffee mug, a mispaid utility bill from 2 months earlier, and one occasion where I had reportedly confused the day of the week as behavioral evidence of progressive cognitive deterioration. The mispaid utility bill was interesting. I had no memory of paying a utility bill incorrectly. I paid my bills through an automated system I had set up years ago. I logged into the system and reviewed the payment history. Every payment had been made correctly, on time, in the proper amount. Someone had made up the utility bill. I leaned back in my chair. They hadn't just filed a fraudulent psychological report. They had fabricated behavioral incidents to support it. This was no longer just greed, poorly disguised as concern. This was a coordinated effort, planned over weeks or months, with multiple deliberate acts of deception. I thought about my son, 9 years old, catching fireflies in the backyard of our house in Raleigh. Patricia holding a mason jar for him, laughing. I thought about the check he wrote to Raymond Purcell. I picked up the phone and called the one person whose number I had been waiting to dial. Her name was Diane Cho. She had worked with me for 11 years at the NIFB before moving into private practice as a forensic financial consultant. She was 48 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and possessed of a mind that I had always privately believed was the sharpest I had ever encountered in a professional setting. She answered before the second ring. "Bobby," she said, "it's been 3 years. "It has," I said. "I need you, Diane. Not as a favor. I'll pay your full rate." "What's the job?" "My son is trying to have me declared incompetent so he can take my estate. He used a fraudulent psychological evaluation as his evidence." A brief silence. "Please tell me they were sloppy," she said. "Extremely," I said. She was in Tampa by Thursday. Diane worked from the dining room table while I worked from my room. My son and daughter-in-law were largely absent work, school pickup, the ordinary traffic of their lives. They had no reason to be worried. The guardianship petition had been filed. The hearing date was set. As far as they knew, I was a slightly confused older man who had once dropped a coffee mug and didn't fully understand what was happening around him. They were not watching me carefully. That was their final mistake. Diane pulled the financial records. Not just my son's personal accounts, those were the obvious surface, but the deeper structure underneath. He had created 2 LLCs in the past 18 months. She found them through the Florida Division of Corporations database, a public record that anyone could access. Both entities were registered to a mailing address in St. Petersburg. Neither had a functional website or a traceable business purpose. One of them, a company called Harmon Legacy Solutions LLC, had already been designated as the proposed financial administrator in the guardianship petition. If the court granted the petition, control of my estate would transfer to that entity. My son had created a company in my name, to receive my own money. The audacity of it was almost architectural. You had to admire the shape of it, even as it turned your stomach. Diane cross-referenced the operating agreements for both LLCs against the account numbers Walter's people had surfaced. The second entity, a company called Suncoast Asset Partners, had already received 2 wire transfers from a probate account associated with Patricia's estate transfers that had been made during the 6 weeks immediately following her death, before I had fully understood what accounts existed or how they were structured. Patricia had left a small secondary account, roughly $40,000, in a credit union where we had banked briefly in the early 90s. It was not the kind of account that appeared prominently in estate documents. It was easy to miss. Someone had not missed it. The wire transfers had been authorized using a power of attorney document, a document bearing my signature on a date when I had been in Raleigh, alone, packing boxes, and had signed nothing. My son had forged my signature. I sat with that for a while. Not with anger. Anger is a loud emotion, and loud emotions are imprecise. I sat with it the way I used to sit with a particularly revealing set of numbers at my desk in the old NIFB office, quietly, letting the full shape of it settle into place. Then I called Walter. "I need one more thing," I said. "I need the name of the best elder law attorney in Tampa who isn't Gerald Frisch." He called me back in 20 minutes. The name was Margaret Bellows. Margaret Bellows was 62 years old and had been practicing elder law in Hillsborough County for 31 years. She was the kind of attorney who wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck and did not smile frequently, because she had spent 3 decades watching people do terrible things to the people who had raised them, and it had calibrated her face accordingly. She came to a coffee shop 3 blocks from the house, at my request. I arrived first, ordered 2 coffees, and set the folder on the table. She sat down, picked up the folder, and read for 11 minutes without speaking. When she finished, she closed the folder, set it down, and looked at me over the top of her glasses. "Mr. Harmon," she said, This is one of the more complete packages of fraudulent evidence I have seen submitted to this court in a guardianship proceeding, and I have seen quite a few. Can we stop it? I asked. We can do considerably more than stop it, she said. But I want to understand something first. She folded her hands on the table. What outcome do you want? I thought about it. I want the truth in front of a judge, I said. All of it. She nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something she had already suspected. Then let's get to work, she said. The hearing was held on a Tuesday morning in late October. Courtroom 4B, in the Hillsborough County Courthouse. It was a small room, beige walls, fluorescent lights, the particular institutional stillness of a place where important things happen to ordinary people every day without ceremony. My son and daughter-in-law were already seated at the petitioner's table when I walked in. Gerald Frisch was beside them, a heavy-set man with the confident posture of someone who rarely loses in rooms like this one. My son was scrolling through his phone. He looked up when the door opened, saw me, and a short, involuntary sound escaped him, half laugh, half exhale. The sound a person makes when they see something they've already decided isn't a threat. My daughter-in-law turned, studied my face for a moment with those careful, calculating eyes, and then turned back to the table and said something quietly to my son. Whatever she said, he nodded. Margaret walked in beside me, set her briefcase on the respondent's table, and sat down with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Then the door from the side hallway opened, and Judge Arthur Connell entered. I had not known, when Margaret scheduled the hearing, which judge would be assigned. She had warned me there were 6 judges who rotated through this courtroom, and that the assignment was random. I knew Arthur Connell. I had not seen him in 14 years, but I knew him. He had been an assistant state attorney in Duval County when I was a young investigator still learning which questions to ask. He had been handed a complex insurance fraud case, a ring operating across 4 counties, fake contractors, manufactured claims, a scheme that had cost 3 major carriers almost $8 million. The case was in chaos when I arrived. The evidence was scattered. The timeline was broken. The key witness had recanted under pressure. I spent 6 days in a rented motel room in Jacksonville, rebuilding the financial architecture from raw transaction records. On the 7th day, I walked into Arthur Connell's office and put 3 pages on his desk. 3 pages that took the entire scheme apart from the inside. He won the case. He won it completely. He had told me afterward, over bad coffee in the courthouse parking lot, that those 3 pages were the best piece of investigative work he had ever seen anyone do. He had never forgotten my name. I knew that because he had sent a handwritten note to my retirement dinner 14 years later. It sat in a box in what had been Patricia's study, in a house I no longer owned, in a city I no longer lived in. Judge Connell settled into his chair, adjusted his glasses, and looked at the docket in front of him. Then, as judges do, he looked up to survey the room. His eyes found me. The change was immediate and total. The professional blankness that judges wear like a uniform, the careful neutrality of someone who has learned to give nothing away. It broke. His chin dropped slightly. His hand, which had been moving toward the gavel, went still on the bench. He leaned forward, almost imperceptibly, like a man who thinks he's seeing something that can't be real. Then, quietly, too quietly for the microphone, but not quiet enough for the room, he said it. Bob Harmon. It wasn't a question. My son's head came up. My daughter-in-law's eyes narrowed. Frisch, who had been adjusting papers, went very still. Every person in the room who didn't know me heard the judge say my name the way you say the name of a person you have cause to remember. And every person in the room who did know me, just one, seated across the aisle with his phone now face down on the table, felt something shift beneath him without yet understanding what it was. Judge Connell composed himself. 14 years of the bench will teach a man to close a door quickly once it's been opened. He cleared his throat, called the case, and proceeded with the professional gravity that the situation required. But the damage was done. Frisch had seen the judge's face. He was a veteran attorney. He knew what that kind of recognition meant. He was already nervous before the first witness was called. Frisch called Dr. Raymond Purcell. Purcell was a smaller man than I had imagined, compact, slightly stooped, wearing a suit that was good but 2 seasons old. He walked to the stand with the measured pace of a man rehearsing his own testimony in his head. He was sworn in. Frisch led him through the expected sequence. His credentials, his methodology, his findings. Purcell testified that I displayed significant markers of cognitive impairment, that my capacity for financial decision-making was materially compromised, and that in his professional opinion, the establishment of guardianship was not merely advisable, but necessary for Mr. Harmon's safety and well-being. He said all of it smoothly. He had clearly rehearsed. Then Margaret stood up. She didn't approach the witness immediately. She stood at the respondent's table, holding a single sheet of paper, and she looked at Purcell with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who has already read the last page of the book. "Dr. Purcell," she said, "when did you conduct your evaluation of my client?" "August 14th, Purcell said. "And the evaluation took place where?" "At my office in Clearwater," he said. "Can you describe the format of the evaluation? What instruments did you use?" Purcell described a standard battery of cognitive assessments: MMSE, MoCA, clock drawing test, verbal fluency tasks. Margaret nodded slowly. She walked toward the bench and addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Respondent's Exhibit A." She handed a document to the court clerk. Frisch leaned over to look at his copy. His expression did not change, but his jaw tightened. "Dr. Purcell," Margaret said, returning her gaze to the witness. "On August 14th, the date you testified that you evaluated my client, where was my client?" Purcell blinked. "I'm not certain what you mean." "I'll assist," Margaret said. "On August 14th, Mr. Harmon was in Raleigh, North Carolina, attending the interment of his wife's memorial marker at Oakwood Cemetery. He drove to Raleigh on August 12th and returned to Tampa on August 16th. Exhibit A includes the Easy Pass toll records from both trips, his hotel receipt in Raleigh, dated August 12th through 15th, and a signed acknowledgement from the cemetery office confirming his presence at the interment on August 14th. A murmur moved through the room. Purcell's composure fractured. His eyes cut to Frisch, then to my son, then back to Margaret. He opened his mouth, closed it. "Dr. Purcell," Margaret said, her voice still even, still unhurried. "Would you like to revise your testimony about when and where this evaluation took place?" Frisch was on his feet. "Objection. Counsel. Is. On what grounds, Counselor?" Judge Connell said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Frisch sat down. Purcell looked at his hands. His voice, when it came, was barely audible. "I may have the date wrong." "The date," Margaret repeated. "Or the evaluation itself?" She let the silence breathe. Then she went to the projector. She placed a document on the glass. A bank record, clean and time-stamped. A personal check from my son's account, made out to Raymond Purcell, for $18,000, dated 3 weeks before the hearing. "Your Honor," she said, "this payment was made to a witness for a cognitive evaluation that, by the witness's own shifting account, may not have occurred as described. I would suggest this is not a matter of a misremembered date." Judge Connell's face had gone to stone. He looked at Purcell with the expression of a man who has been in this room long enough to recognize exactly what he is looking at. "Mr. Purcell," the judge said quietly, "you are currently under oath. I would encourage you to think very carefully before you say anything further." Purcell said nothing further. The judge turned to the bailiff. "My son took the stand at Frisch's insistence. It was a desperate move. The kind of gamble that men make when everything else has already failed and they haven't accepted it yet. He was composed at first. He spoke about his concern for me, his fear after my thanks in advance, his desire to ensure I was protected. He described me as confused, forgetful, reluctant to accept help. He was credible in the way that people who have rehearsed extensively can be credible, fluent, emotionally modulated, almost sympathetic." Margaret let him finish. Then she stood up. She asked him about the 2 LLCs. He said they were planning vehicles, estate planning tools, standard practice. She asked him about Harmon Legacy Solutions, which bore my name. He said it was intended to simplify asset management on my behalf. He used the phrase "on my behalf" carefully, like a man who has been coached on which words to reach for. She asked him about Suncoast Asset Partners. He paused. She asked about the 2 wire transfers from Patricia's estate account, the credit union account, the one easy to miss totaling $41,000. She asked who had authorized those transfers. My son said he would need to look at the documents before commenting. Margaret placed the documents in front of him. He looked at them for a long moment. Then Margaret placed a second document beside the first. It was a copy of the power of attorney instrument that had been used to authorize the transfers. She asked him to look at the signature on the last page. He looked at it. "Is that your father's signature?" she asked. He didn't answer. "Mr. Harmon," she said, "is that your father's signature?" He looked at Frisch. Frisch was looking at the table. My son set the document down. He looked at his hands. Something moved across his face, not remorse, not yet, but the first contact with the reality of an ending. Margaret turned to Judge Connell. "Your Honor, Respondent's Exhibit F is an affidavit from a certified forensic document examiner retained last week, who has examined the signature on this power of attorney and concluded with a high degree of professional certainty that it does not match Robert Harmon's known signature exemplars. It is, in his opinion, a forgery." The room was quiet in a specific way, the quiet of people not moving, not breathing more than they have to, because something large is occupying the available space. My son sat in the witness box with his hands on his knees and said nothing. I looked at him. My son, 41 years old, who had caught fireflies in mason jars, who had called me 3 days after his mother's funeral and said, "Dad, we want you close." I thought, I know you did. In whatever way you were capable of it. In that moment, I believe that was true. I also thought, it doesn't change the ledger. Judge Connell dismissed the guardianship petition in its entirety. He referred the matter to the state attorney's office for review of the fraudulent evaluation and the forged signature. He was precise and economical in his language, the way experienced judges are when they have made up their minds completely. Then he looked at me across the courtroom, and he said, "Mr. Harmon, this court finds no evidence whatsoever of cognitive impairment or financial incapacity. The record will reflect that this proceeding was initiated on a fraudulent evidentiary basis." He paused. "It's good to see you," he said. "Even under these circumstances, my son was charged 7 weeks later with forgery of a legal instrument and fraudulent transfer of estate assets." Frisch withdrew from representation immediately. Purcell agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge on the perjury count. My son hired a defense attorney and spent 4 months trying to negotiate a plea that would keep him out of a correctional facility. He did not succeed. The forgery charge carried mandatory minimums that his attorney could not negotiate around. He was sentenced to 22 months and ordered to make full restitution. My daughter-in-law was not charged. The evidence did not establish that she had known about the forged signature or the fabricated behavioral incidents. She knew about the petition. She knew about Purcell. Whether she understood the full architecture of what her husband had built, I cannot say with certainty. I gave that question to whatever accounting system operates above my pay grade and let it go. She and my grandson moved to her mother's house in Georgia after the sentencing. My grandson called me from there. 6 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, he asked if I was okay. He asked if I was angry. I told him I was okay. I told him that being angry at people for being who they are is like being angry at weather. You dress for it. You prepare. But you don't waste your energy shouting at the sky. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Grandpa, you really are kind of like a spy." I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in several months, and it surprised me a little the ease of it, the way it came out without effort. "Maybe a little," I said. I rented a small house in St. Petersburg that fall, 3 blocks from the water. Nothing large. 2 bedrooms, a back porch where I could sit in the evening and watch the light change over the bay. I bought a good coffee maker and a used kayak and a bookshelf that I filled, slowly, with books I had always meant to read. I transferred full control of Patricia's foundation, a small scholarship fund she had established for nursing students at the community college in Raleigh, back to its proper administrators, and added a contribution from the recovered estate funds. The $41,000 that had been wired out came back, plus interest, through the restitution order. Patricia would have had opinions about all of it. Strong, clear, specifically worded opinions that she would have delivered with characteristic directness and then followed with a cup of tea and a hand on my arm and the look that said, "Okay, now that's settled. What's next?" What was next was quiet. Deeply, genuinely quiet. I didn't miss the work, not the field work. Anyway, but sometimes, on the porch in the evenings, I would think about the moment the attorney at the head of that conference table looked up and said my name, the way his face changed. Not from respect, exactly, but from recognition. The recognition of something he had thought was finished and gone, turning out to be present and operational and very much unfinished. I thought about what my son believed when he filed that petition. He believed that being old meant being over, that the years between a man's working life and his final accounting were just a long, slow fade, a diminishment, quiet and predictable, that could be managed and redirected by people with more energy and fewer scruples. He believed that I was a past tense person, a story already told. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about it the way young people are often wrong about age. Not cruelly, not with malice, but with the specific blind spot of someone who has not yet lived long enough to understand that depth is not the same as volume, that silence is not the same as absence, that a man who has spent 30 years learning how everything comes apart is not a man you want to face across a conference table. I hope, somewhere in the 22 months he has, he figures that out. I hope he figures out a great many things. I am 68 years old. I drink my coffee black. I kayak on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, early, before the water traffic picks up. I read in the evenings. I call my grandson on Sundays. I am not invisible. I was never invisible. I was just waiting for the right moment to make one clean cut.